So my point from last week that I had to read through again, and we were chatting in the doc, was basically a thank you to the folks in observability that have been working on tunnels. I think Igor helped a bit out there as well, and it's now much easier and actually possible to load larger time frames of data. There's some links in the doc from last week pointing those out. That's all I wanted to say about that. Jakob, you have the next one.
Thanks. Yeah, Sean asked that I talk about this after all because I've been a bit on the fence. Um, uh, I have some tools that I made for myself to work with virtual machines on my Mac, and I keep telling people, "Oh, you can just do this on the Mac, and it's not so hard." But then I can't really explain it well, or I feel like I owe people an explanation. So I thought I would just briefly demo these tools. And so uh, this is not directly about something that the team has been working on, but it's something I use for my job, and it may help productivity of other people. Although the other thing is that these tools, I'm not sure other people will be happy using them, but they work for me, and I'm just going to show what's possible. And for that, I need to share my screen, and I'm going to share the whole desktop. So this thing is online at this repo because I made these things for myself. I namespace the commands with my initials. So it's a very small repo, and if you run make install, you get a thing that can boot a virtual machine on Mac, and I think that's useful. I should first demo how it works. So it's a command jvxh that is sort of the interface, and I can make a new virtual machine, and then I have to give it a disk size also, and then that is how do you get a tree? Or maybe I don't have that.
But you can do find dot.
Yeah, find. Okay, I'll just do find dot. So it creates a very simple directory structure, and this contains all the state of the virtual machine. The disk is just a file, and there is a directory where the kernel is that you use when booting, and when installing or setting up a virtual machine, you sometimes need a different kernel, and that goes in the install directory. And config is a JSON file that says this virtual machine has 2 CPUs and 2 GB of RAM, and currently no kernel command line options. Then I always forget how to do these things, so my command has built-in notes about how to do common things, and these are pretty copy-pastable. And I would now copy-paste this and start setting up an Ubuntu machine, except the downloading it takes too long, so I'm going to cheat and cd into a different directory where I've already done this. So if we look here, then in the install directory, there is well, a couple of files, and there's a disk image. That is why the download takes so long, because that is actually it's not. It got extended to 20 GB. So anyway, the next step, I should open a new terminal and follow my own notes. So I've done this bit, and then I'm going to do this. And now it boots a virtual machine, and the virtual machine has a terminal attached to it, a serial console, and that is in the terminal. So my terminal is now directly connected to what the virtual machine thinks is a serial port. And it fails to boot. But that's okay, because now we're in single user mode and we can do stuff. And I just copy paste some more things. So I mount what is going to be the boot disk. And I set up a root password. And I create SSH keys. And then I need to write some configuration for the network card. The network card gets just DHCP, and it gets an IP address from macOS. So that's very convenient. And then I need to get out of the change root. And then I need to power down. So I can do this. And my virtual machine stopped. And if I would try to boot it now, it wouldn't know where the root disk is. So I need to edit the config file and say the root device is dev VDA because it's the first disk that it sees. And now I can boot it like this. And this looks like Ubuntu because it is Ubuntu. Okay, no, that wasn't too long. It's still saying stuff, but I can log in with root and the password I just set up. And then I need to run a few final commands because right now there's almost no space on the disk for 64 megabytes, even though the device is 20 gigabytes large. So I need to resize the file system and create a user so I don't have to do everything as root. And now I have a user. And if I go into this user, then I have a home directory, so I can make an SSH directory and create an authorized keys file. And then copy my own authorized keys. And if I now look at what the IP address of this box is, then it's this. So here I can now say this, yes. And now I have a virtual machine. And this works exactly the same as a cloud virtual machine. So like from a user experience point of view, like if you would go on Amazon or Google Cloud or anything, you say click virtual machine and I want this image and I want this and this and this. And in the end, you get an IP address that you can SSH into. And I have all that, but it's all running on my Mac. And it looks like a process. I don't know if it's this one, but it just looks like a process that sits there. When it doesn't use this thing is not using a lot of memory, and that also means that it's not using a lot of memory on my Mac. So I can have a bunch of these running at the same time. I actually have one running that is running GitLab, an omnibus image right next to it. So if I want to test an omnibus image, I just install it on one of these virtual machines. And then I can try stuff. So that is roughly what it does. And I'm going to pause for questions and then I'll show you how it works.
Yeah, so I guess I already know the answer to this, but it's not really. I just have to face it. It's not a question. So this is using macOS's virtualization framework rather than QEMU or
what has been happening?
Heavier or cross-platform virtualization thingy.
Yeah, tools that exist that do this exist for a long time, but over time Apple has been building it into the operating system. So they're effectively commoditizing what it takes to run a virtual machine. And it's not as fully featured as what you can do with VirtualBox or Parallels or anything like that, but it gets better and better. And it's Apple, like the operating system knows enough about Linux to run Linux. And this sort of gets into how it's built. Ideally, there should be a command that comes with macOS that lets you run a virtual machine, but there isn't one. But they have a library that does it. So I made a very small command that talks to the library and that then boots the virtual machine.
So you built the command for them.
Yeah. They I linked to the dev docs. Like they have like sample projects on there to like run GUI Linux in a virtual machine on Mac or run a Mac
in a Mac. Yeah.
In a Mac. But they don't provide these pre-built. You have to like copy and paste them and then build them. And like they're obviously like there's a lot of stuff hard coded, but like it feels like they've got to the point where they've given you all the bits to make this, but they haven't actually given you the virtual machine manager.
They haven't put it together, and there is no user experience because there's only the bits and pieces, and you have to use them yourself. So I built my own user experience around it, and that works. It's possible. So I can show a little bit what it looks like, how I built this. There are two parts to it. There's an Objective-C executable that talks to the library, and then there's a Ruby script that does everything I don't want to do in Objective-C because I don't know Objective-C very well. So the Objective-C thing, this is mostly copy-pasted from the Apple documentation. It goes through the motions of creating a configuration object and attaching a serial port to it, adding a virtual disk, which is that file that is the disk image, adding a network configuration to it. And it needs to know how much memory to use and how many CPU cores and things like that. And then it puts it all together and it says start. And then Apple creates that magic process that you see in the process manager. So it creates one of those. And when you shut down the machine, then this program also exits.
When are you going to rewrite it in Swift?
Well, actually, most people, the documentation encourages you to use Swift, but I find it easier and shorter to write it in Objective-C. Because there are example projects out there that use Swift, but then you need to have a complicated directory structure. Because Swift looks a bit like a Rails app, where things need to be organized in a certain way, and this is really just one file.
Yeah,
so I like
there's another project I can link to that does basically the same thing written in Swift. And it's funny what you mentioned about Ruby and Objective-C, because it has a similar like management tool that's written in Bash that has the commands, and there's an open PR on that project to like rewrite that in Swift instead of Bash. But I'm sure that they wrote it in Bash initially because they were like, I don't want to be dealing with like, setting up a screen process and stuff like this in Swift, when like that's the thing that Bash could do very effectively. So
so these people did it in Swift. So this thing is written in Swift, and I mean, I'm complaining about Swift, but it's really not that bad. It's 300 lines of code, and they have a little more features, so that's probably why it's longer. It's probably pretty terse as it is. But then to make it useful, they have another command around it, which is a bash script to do more glue stuff that I didn't want to do in Swift. And you also see this in open source projects, in other projects where there's a core command that does some of the hard work, but then it's very hard to use, and then you need a wrapper. Somebody else writes a wrapper around it that makes it user friendly. It's a common pattern. I'm not saying it's great, but that's how that's what I did here. And I actually started out, this was a wrapper around another command, and then that other command stopped working after a macOS upgrade. So then I made a replacement for that thing, and I kept using this command. So I was using xhive, which stopped work, which is, I won't go into what xhive is, but xhive stopped working after one of the macOS upgrades. And then Apple broke xhive, but they created virtualization framework. So I thought, okay, I'll rebuild the bits I need. So this is the Ruby tool that does the management, and yeah, it does little things like don't start the virtual machine more than once. I did that once. That's really bad because then you're corrupting your disk. Uncompress the kernel if it's needed, and it builds these commands. So this is the executable, and then it feeds in all the options, which would be very cumbersome. So this thing really just builds a command based on what's in the config file, like the number of CPUs.
And having said what I just said about Bash, I feel like this is the sort of the forgotten thing about Ruby, is that it's actually really quite good for scripting, like things like this.
I'd rather write this in Ruby than in Bash. That's why mine has Ruby. But I completely understand why people would do it in Bash too, because it's the same kind of job, but I find it more pleasant in Ruby. And it does a bunch of other things that are useful. Like if you want to install, what I just did was based on a cloud init image and a disk image, which is what Ubuntu makes for booting a cloud server, which is very convenient. But the standard way to package a Linux distribution is a DVD, or it used to be a CD-ROM. And the idea is that you boot once with the DVD in your drive, and then you copy things from the DVD onto your hard drive, and then when you're done, you throw the DVD away. And when you do that, this thing doesn't know how to get the kernel from the DVD. So then you need to mount the DVD ISO file and copy the kernel off. And that is annoying on macOS, but I looked on Stack Overflow how to do it. So this is the automating the Stack Overflow magic to mount a DVD image so you can copy the kernel off. So I put those things in there. Another little thing here is snapshotting. So the disk is just a file, and if you want to snapshot it, you shut down the machine, you make a copy of the file. It's a file with lots of holes in it, and it's very useful to make a sparse copy. And the GNU version of copy can do sparse copy. So I specifically use GNU copy and not regular copy, because otherwise the snapshots get very big. And I can quickly demo that, because I showed you that I had this GitLab running here on this IP address. So if I go to that machine, where is that? Oh, I can see the top of my, it's this one. So this one has an omnibus on it, but I can power this off. And then this thing stops working. And it takes a little while for GitLab to stop. I'm going to show you a snapshot restore, just to show that that is, because that's actually what I do a lot with on these VMs that I've dedicated for Omnibus, because I install a different package and I don't want to worry about, did I cleanly uninstall everything? I just want to reset the VM to a known state.
Yeah, GitLab uninstall has some issues, like as well. Like it can leave things around that then make a new install not work as expected.
Yeah.
With Omnibus.
So I can do a restore, and then it wants the file, and I have one where I named apt-get upgrade, and it was from this timestamp.
So this is a previous one that you're restoring to.
Yeah.
And the command to produce that was jvxh snapshot.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, and that puts the timestamp in there. So jvxh snapshot creates disk.timestamp dot whatever name you gave the snapshot. So that copy ran in 10 seconds or something. And if I boot this now, then I have a working machine again. It gets the time. It gets the time from NTP. So because that's one of the problems when you do snapshots, that your clock is all. I just mistyped my password. But I just grabbed the time from that work time protocol, because these Ubuntu boxes are configured with that. And now if I look in the op directory, there's nothing. So now I can start over and install a different omnibus if I have to.
So if you wanted to create a second VM based on the first one, can you just shut down this VM, do a copy of the directory, and go from there? Or is anything else needed?
You could, but they would have the same MAC address, and the MAC address is you would have to delete this UUID file, because that gets hashed into a MAC address, so that every time the machine boots, it has the same MAC, because then the operating systems, there's a DHCP server somewhere that gives you the same IP every time. So yes, you can copy this, and then if you delete this, then the other one gets a new IP, and then you have another snapshot. These are the kind of features that better virtual machine managers have. I remember that VMware Fusion can do this, where you can clone a machine and you can create sort of descendant copies from a single image, and that's very nice. But from myself, I wanted something more lightweight. So this idea, it's just a directory and that's it. Makes sense to me. But yeah.
Yeah, I think what's nice about this project and similar ones is that you probably wouldn't tell someone to just, well, you could just clone it and run it, but you can also just fork it and like make the changes you need directly, because it's small enough that that's not actually going to be an issue. Like keeping up with upstream Jakob or upstream some other random person on Git. GitHub is not going to be that arduous. Like these aren't frequently these aren't moving targets.
I don't really know, like in the long run, if it's good. I think I think it's better if there are well-maintained tools and not everybody has to make their own tools. I just really like making my own tools. So for myself, it makes me happy to do this. But I hope that Apple will eventually make an executable for this, or like this will grow and solidify a bit more, and it will become a commodity. Running a Linux VM on Mac should be a commodity, and all the pieces are there. And once that's a commodity, then maybe you also get more standardized tools. But even with this whole duct tape do-it-yourself approach, it's already usable because I've been using this for 2 years now or something, or 3, and I use it every day for me to do my job on, and it works.
Yeah, I did find another project yesterday called Art that does this, but it is designed for CI. It's much bigger, and it's also got one of those weird fair source licenses or something like that, where like it has specific like CPU restrictions unless you're an individual and whatnot. So yeah, but it's designed for building things for CI rather than building things for use on your machine, which is why it's a lot bigger as well. So yeah.
But anyway, you can do all of this stuff with VirtualBox too, which is what most people would do, I think. But if you, for whatever reason, don't want to use VirtualBox, one of the nice things about this is because it's so integrated into the operating system now, is that you can do. I never ran sudo. Like none of this needs root because it's properly fenced off by the operating system, which is kind of nice. Anyway, thanks for listening. And we should go to the next person, and that's Sean.
Yeah, thanks. So I was just looking at a thing. I'm not sure if we're actually going to do it right now, but I just wanted to talk about the plan. One thing we could do to help out the dedicated teams is provide capacity planning for them. So like these are essentially different environments. They're not GitLab production, GitLab.com production, but they are production environment for dedicated tenants. And we have a capacity planning tool. How could we use that for them? So I think the way we could do that is to split things up a bit. So first of all, I'm just sort of hand waving over where do we get the metrics from. So Andrew's got an issue open to add a remote write endpoint so that we can write from AWS where dedicated is into our main metrics platform, which I think we would want for things like Switchboard, because Switchboard we should have in our metrics catalog. Like Switchboard is the thing that customers can use to can customers use it directly? I think they can, to manage the configuration of their GitLab instance for things that can't be configured in the GitLab UI. And we'd want like metrics and alerting for that, and there's a separate project for that. But those would go to the Switchboard team rather than to the EOC from reliability or scalability or whatever. But we'd want those metrics in there, but we would probably also want the dedicated tenant metrics in there if that's feasible. So I think if we ignore that, I think the main thing from the Tamland, or the main things from the Tamland side are the repo as it stands is 2 things, which makes sense. Like there's no point in splitting them up right now, which is that it's a library/program that generates a capacity planning report based on some input, but it also contains that input data directly. So we have, I'll just share my screen actually. So like most of the CI file is about, managing the project itself, but we also have these data files. So we have book.yaml, we have saturation.json, and then we have the book markdown files that are generated from book.yaml. So saturation.json is the export of the saturation points from the that use the metrics catalog in the runbooks repo as JSON. book.yaml describes which services go on which pages. So if we were doing this for dedicated, for instance, we obviously wouldn't have a customers page because each dedicated tenant is not going to have its own customers.gitlab.com. They won't have a Redis rate limiting, stuff like that. And so those are fairly sort of decoupled anyway. There are a couple of other places where we assume things about production environments, but that shouldn't be too bad. We also have this data directory, which just holds a cache, but that's already essentially passed around as a tarball, like by fetching it from the generic package registry thing. So that's, again, fairly well abstracted. So we assume that the default environment is this, which we should probably pull out somewhere. And I think in here, we also directly refer to, GPRD here, which we'd need to not do. But basically, that's ready. So we could consider splitting this into 2 repos where like the main Tamland repo is just the code. And then it provides a CI file that you can include in other repos that does things like check that the template have been updated to match book.yaml, populate the cache for whatever environment this is, generate the pages, and manage the issues on whatever project you're supposed to manage them on. So that's one part. I think the splitting in separate repos is actually quite easy with GitLab CI, because we would just clone the parent repo, but we'd also do the remote include thing from GitLab CI, so we'd get the tasks there. The local development experience, I haven't totally thought about that yet, whether we'd use a submodule or whether we'd do something else, because like you'd need that code and that environment available to run, to build the markdown files that I mentioned from the book.yaml. So we'd need to think about that a bit more. The other thing we need to do is to do with saturation.json. So in the runbooks repo, we generate saturation.json based on these, what do we call them? We call them saturation cube. Yeah, saturation monitoring. So we have all these files that define a saturation point. So for instance, this is cube node IPs. And then this, is JSONic code. So it creates a resource saturation point that, ends up in that JSON file, like things get templated in and stuff. This applies to here is not a good example, but applies to can also be like, get me a list of services with this tag, or, that are provisioned on Kubernetes or whatever. And in the runbooks, we also have, where is the get hybrid thing? Yeah, so we have in the reference architectures, we have this, which is essentially used for dedicated as far as I can tell. So, we use GitLab Environment Toolkit to build dedicated tenants, and these already have some of the things that we provide on GitLab.com, so dashboards and rules, for instance. It does have a metrics config, which I thought, oh, great, we can just use these saturation monitoring objects. Like we can already just generate this. But the problem is these reference the existing ones. So if I take CPU maybe for an example. Yeah, so this is evaluated from here, so from the Get Hybrid environment, but it's then just importing the metrics catalog that is global, which means that finding VM provision services will find services that we do not care about for dedicated, or won't exist, or won't make sense. It might miss services that exist in a different format there. Go back to my earlier example, like there wouldn't be a Redis rate limiting on dedicated. I think they just have a persistent Redis and a cache Redis. So like, because one's configured as an LRU and one's configured to keep everything, and that does everything else. And Yeah, so we'd need to provide, probably make this function take a function of metrics catalogs, so that we could then create a separate metrics catalog. I don't know how detailed that metrics catalog would need to be for this environment that lists the services that are actually available in this environment. But it's getting, I mean, a lot of the work's already there, so it's getting pretty close.
One question on this one, Sean.
Mhm.
Could it make sense to tag services and sort of say this one exists in dedicated and this one doesn't?
That's a good idea, actually. Yeah. So we could definitely do that with the way we have things at the moment. So if we look at web, we have tags of Golang and Rails, which affect a couple of things. Like you can search for saturation points based on them, but also they think they affect dashboard tags, maybe. But we could do that as long as
But we'd still need something for the services that exist in dedicated, but not for us.
yeah, I was gonna say, as long as dedicated is purely a subset of our metrics catalog, that would work. And it might well be a subset of our metrics catalog. Like we might be able to get away with that. I don't know if it has like the web API Git split. I haven't actually checked.
Just web service, I think.
Okay, but if it doesn't, like, we could possibly do some like labeling stuff to, yeah, web service, there you go. We could possibly do some labeling stuff to get around that, rather than reinvent the wheel. Because what I don't want to do is have to essentially copy all this over. Like, we don't need this. Equally, like these service dependencies wouldn't be right in dedicated, but we wouldn't actually need them for what we're doing here anyway. We just need to know which services exist in dedicated.
I think dedicated already has this kind of thing somewhere.
Yeah. Oops. Let's not talk about that. Yeah, there is this. Oh, there we go. Okay, fine. So we do have a metric catalog. We just need to pass that in then.
Yeah, we need to. So yeah, make sure that we can get like the way we switch over metrics config just by changing the imports. We should get that to be different then.
Yeah. So at the moment,
metrics config dot services or whatever.
Yeah, at the moment the saturation point import the metrics config, and they should probably return a function that takes the metrics config as an argument and then evaluates them based on that, so that they're agnostic. But yeah, I think that could work. Yeah, we already have the service catalog basically, so I think that's good. And yeah, what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, for the environment, the other thing we could do instead of changing the code is Marco already added this services end mapping thing. So if this is exhaustive, we could just add a default like environment here or whatever, right? And then we could just use this file a bit more. But I think that's what we'd need. So essentially we'd end up with a Tamland GPRD, a Tamland dedicated tenant one project and stuff like that. I think is how it would look eventually.
I was wondering about that, because Tamland is now about one big installation, but dedicated will have many installations. So if we just random number, if we have 1,000 dedicated installations, does that mean we generate 1,000 Tamland sites?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So
and then who looks at those?
Yeah, the requirement I've got at the moment is that this not be the same pages site. So obviously a GitLab pages site is coupled to a project. But I don't know if all dedicated tenants could be on the same pages site. I think that would probably be more convenient going forward, because all dedicated tenants will share this architecture. So like from a Tamland perspective, everything's the same except probably the environment name, I guess, the environment selector. And so from a Tamland perspective, we'd probably want to just say Tamland GitLab.com and Tamland dedicated, rather than Tamland dedicated tenant one. So yeah, I don't know, but I would think we could, we could generate like, a pager site with different directories per dedicated tenant, and then who's going to look at them? I assume we'd create the same issues as we do now, and then all the issue management code is in Tamland itself, so we create the same issues we do now, and then I guess that's a problem for the dedicated team. Don't know.
Yeah, you've already got to build this in like 3 days, so.
So yeah, I don't know how important that is for them. It was just I was asked to look at things we could do for the dedicated team, so that was one of them. And I need to get things. Well, it's already written down in the epic, but I also need to get things written down. Sorry, out of my head before I finish up. Igor, would it make sense to put the reusable bits into common CI tasks? I think it depends. I think if they are agnostic to the project entirely, like there's a Python formatting task, for instance, that could probably go in common CI tasks, because like any project that uses Python could say, I'm going to run this Python formatting task. I think for things like make sure the book directory is up to date with the book.yaml inputs is more Tamland specific. So I think that probably doesn't work so much in common CI tasks, because literally no non-Tamland project would work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Yes, Rachel, I will link to this conversation once the recording's uploaded.
Thank you.
Igor, I think you're next.
All right. So story time. This came up in On-Call this week, and I just happened to stumble over this, and it rang a bell for me. So WallG is what we use for Postgres continuous archiving. So that's uploading wall segments as they're produced, as well as base backups, which is kind of the nightly snapshot that we do. And we had an issue where WallG base backup failed. So since I'd kind of dug into WallG issues before, I just wanted to take a very short peek at this one. And so I saw this report of the logs of WallG backup, and it says, failed to run a retrievable func, Google API 404, retrying attempt. And this looked very familiar and very similar to an issue that we had 1 year ago, which was not for the base backups, but it was for the continuous archiving, but it's the same tool. So chances are it's a similar code path and possibly a similar underlying issue. And so the underlying issue previously was a race condition where if you have concurrent WallG processes, there's a race condition. So the basic upload loop is gonna select a wall file, slice that file up into chunks, and then for each chunk, it's gonna upload the chunk to a bucket, and then it's gonna, so basically this happens concurrently, I believe, and then there's a compose object call that merges those chunks into a single object. And then once that's done, it deletes the temporary chunks. So the issue is if two or more processes are doing this thing concurrently, then they'll kind of upload this to the same location because there's no random element in this file name. One of the compose calls is going to succeed, and all other subsequent compose object calls are going to fail because the first one deleted these chunks, so they no longer exist. And instead of saying, oh, something went wrong, I'm going to bail out, it goes into this retry loop, which is never going to succeed because it just keeps getting a 404 because these chunks are never going to reappear. So that was the issue 1 year ago. And
why do we run more than one of them at the same time?
Yes, so that shouldn't happen. And the fix was, let's not run more than one of them at the same time. Yes. And so same question exists for base backups. We should also not run more than one of them at the same time. And so there's basically two approaches. Either ensure that they're not concurrent, or have a separate prefix in the bucket so that they're effectively not working on the same files. And this is probably the one that we want. And so I went looking on the host, and to my surprise, there actually was a console lock process. So we are doing the locking. So the next question is, why is this locking?
So the natural reason why more than one is running at the same time is because we have a bunch of Postgres replicas, and they're all trying to do the same job, and they need to coordinate with console.
Yes.
But it's not like one box is spawning multiple Volties. We have multiple boxes that are doing the same thing.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
And basically one of them wins.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if we don't need to designate a single box, that if that box goes away,
yeah, no, that's not a good design.
Right?
No, it's better if they all do it. Yeah.
So it's for redundancy reasons. And yeah, so I kind of looked at this and seemed like that should work. The other thing that I noticed was we have some new Postgres hosts that are doing this stuff. So we've got Petroni 101 and 121, and I don't know the details, but
what do the numbers mean?
I don't know. I think it's
it doesn't mean we have 101 Petroni boxes.
No. But it looked to me like these are designated to maybe be for base backups specifically, and we have two of them for redundancy, but I'm not entirely sure on that. So I don't quite know, but in any case, that's something that kind of jumped out to me. And so yeah, I'm actually on the 101 box here, and I looked a bit closer at this console lock line, and one of the things that jumped out is the name of the lock actually includes the 101. So it includes the host name, which means
they all get their own lock, and they all get
their own lock. Yes.
So you can't use two processes on the same machine is what this is protecting against right now.
Sure. Yeah. And so that's weird. Why is that happening? So I looked at the backup.sh file, and here's how we compute the lock name. So we take the host name, we match on -2 numbers -db. Well, we've got 3 numbers here, so this no longer matches. So we kind of broke the assumption that we have less than 100. Well, we do have less than 100 hosts, but less than 100 named hosts. Let's put it that way. And so by breaking that assumption, this regex no longer removes this part. and that explains what we're seeing. So yeah, I thought that was kind of a fun find. And yeah, short-term fix is basically fixing this regex, which indeed, where is the fix here? Which is pretty much the obvious thing, right? But then the longer term fix is actually configure this lock name as something a bit more explicit. So instead of
Not the
trying to,
host name.
right, not instead
Right,
of
there
trying
must
to
be a
guess
logical
it,
name for the
yeah,
cluster somewhere in the
instead of guessing
Postgres
it
config.
from the host name,
Yeah,
we're using the Petroni cluster name, I think is what it's called. So that's going to make this a lot more robust.
there must be something that Petroni is using to distinguish clusters, and
yeah.
and that's the identifier
that's
we
it.
should have been using all along. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I just thought it was kind of a neat find and a fun story to retell.
I've got the next item. I don't have a
Yeah,
lot
go for it.
to say about that, but I wanted to bring it up because Igor is on the call and I want to verify my plan. So I noticed yesterday, when looking into some Redis memory things that are going on, that we don't have Redis memory saturation points. So we measure. Wait, I'm not sharing my screen. We measure memory utilization in several different ways. One of them is just node memory. How much memory is used on the node versus how much does it have configured. And that's what we have been talking about. And then I want to compare it to, this was in this issue, to Redis memory. That's where Matt and I are talking about it. Yeah, here. And then I noticed that, so for Redis host, we have three different measures. We have one, just the node versus used memory. Then we have Redis memory used versus max memory. And then other hosts like this persistent one doesn't have max memory. So we also have reported memory used by Redis over node. Yeah, how much memory is on the node. What is missing is we match here on instance. So the node exporter and the Redis exporter are two different things. So these metrics don't match anymore.
Yeah, we saw this in some other place, and the fix was to change this to match on FQDN instead, I believe.
Why? Because the Kubernetes metrics, and we do run Redis and Kubernetes, don't have FQDN. Why is the port included in instance? So I was first working around this with some label replace cleverness in the saturation points itself. But then I thought, do we actually need this port in anything? Because, yeah, for instance.
Isn't it a Prometheus thing that it includes it when it scrapes?
This comes from instance is a label that we label replace like with what
We
is it
put it on
called?
there.
We put it
Oh,
on
it's
there.
from us. Okay, I
I've
thought it
as
was
far
Prometheus as
no
well.
no.
Okay.
That's what I was going to ask you. I found something in our metrics config that comes from vendor. Let's see where if I can find what I was looking at. No, what was it? Target label. Yes. So I found this. This is already what I was adjusting, so let's look at the diff that I made. It used to be like this. We use bottom target and we name it instance from now on. And my suggestion would be to get the number off. Do you think that's a safe thing to do?
I don't know. Maybe.
Do you think it's a better thing to do, or should we like work around it specifically for
Well,
this case?
I think if you have two Go processes on the same box, then the Go Prometheus client, I think, always exports some metrics about the Go runtime, and those would then clash.
In which case are we using that? Because
I don't know where we do it, but you're asking like, is it okay to do this? And
Yeah.
They would, yeah.
Unless we have another label like job that
right,
disambiguates them, which
probably is the case.
Maybe we have in all cases, probably.
Yeah.
My understanding
maybe
was
not.
we added instance because we started to have stuff in Kubernetes, and then we needed to like have something like FQDN there.
Yeah, if that's the case, and if we have another label that differentiates them, then it sounds safe and sensible to me to have an actual concept instead of slapping FQDN, cluster, namespace, pod on everything, right? Because that's kind of the Kubernetes equivalent of FQDN.
And it was my understanding that we wanted instance to be there for everything, and that to be the new FQDN. But right now we can't use it as that.
That's news to me, but sounds legit.
I have no idea if it's like that because I can't find it. So okay.
Maybe ask Andrew.
I'll do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I have the last item. So this is the last team demo with Sean. So I just wanted to take the opportunity and say it's been great working with you and wishing you all the best on your future endeavors.
Thanks.
Yeah, we'll be really sad to see you log off on Wednesday.
Yeah, well, as you know, it's not actually my choice when I log off. My laptop just gets wiped. So yeah.
Yeah, so you have to say goodbye. You've got to put your farewell Slack messages on there before that call, because then yeah, you got basically Wednesday afternoon off.
Yes.
How much time are you taking again between the roles?
2 weeks. So yeah, the Easter holidays essentially, which I think you're taking off anyway. So yeah, no, it's going to be sad. I think I really have enjoyed working at GitLab a huge amount, and I really appreciate working remotely, but leaving a remote job is very different to leaving an in-person job, I'm discovering. So yeah, I hope to stay in touch. I know it's difficult, but I will at least be back in the alumni Slack channel whenever that gets set up. I don't really know how any of this works. So yeah, but it's been great working with you all, and I've learned a huge amount from working at GitLab, but especially being on this team. It's been great.
Yeah, it has been. We'll definitely all miss you quite a lot. Cool. Well, with that, I think we've come to the end of the demo for today. Thank you so much, and thank you to whoever's recording. Please do upload it when you get there. Yeah, hope you all have a good rest of your day, and we will chat soon.